Good day, emergency management class. My name is David Garcia, and my presentation today is a review of the book Typhoid Mary, Captive to the Public's Health by Judith Walser-Leavitt. So who exactly was Mary Mallon, or Typhoid Mary Mallon? Well, there isn't a lot of personal background or biographical information about Mary Mallon in this book, or online for that matter. And her personal life is mostly overshadowed, obviously, by her involvement in a typhoid fever outbreak in New York in the early 1900s. Mary Mallon was born in 1869 in Cookstown County, Tyrone, Ireland, and immigrated to the United States in 1884. Miss Mallon was a great cook and found employment in the kitchens of many wealthy New York families. At the age of 37, she was the first person in North America to be identified, chartered, and reported in literature as a healthy or asymptomatic typhoid fever carrier. And that's very important to note because all throughout the investigation to find out where the typhoid fever was coming from and how all these individuals were being infected by it in New York, it's very hard to track down the person that is spreading the fever or spreading the disease if they do not exhibit any kind of symptoms. So it's very important to note that for this case. She died November 11th, 1938, on North Brother Island in the Bronx in New York. North Brother Island was actually the location where she was isolated against her will for many years of her life. So the case that started it all was at the Thompson homestead on Oyster Bay, Long Island. During the summer of 1906, Mary Mallon began working in the rented summer home of New York banker Charles Henry Warren in Oyster Bay, Long Island. Typhoid fever ended up infecting 6 out of the 11 people that were lodging in the Oyster Bay household at that time. The owners of the home, Mr. and Mrs. George Thompson, hired investigators to uncover where the infection may have come from. But those original investigators' findings proved to be inconclusive, and they actually even ended up blaming the wrong people or the wrong employees at the homestead at that time. The Thompsons, realizing that the home may become a wasted investment if they didn't find out where the outbreak was coming from, so they ended up hiring a more professional investigator named George Soper, who was a civil engineer, but he was also known for his epidemiological analysis of typhoid fever epidemics. So who was George Soper? Well, he was born and raised in New York City. He obtained a Bachelor of Science degree in 1895 at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. After that, he returned to New York City and achieved his PhD in sanitary engineering in 1899. He had already established a successful career in engineering by the time the Thompsons hired him to investigate the outbreak at their Oyster Bay home. In fact, by the start of his investigation at the Oyster Bay residence, Dr. Soper had already had several successful typhoid fever outbreak investigations under his belt. Soper's findings proceed as followed. Soper studied the records of the Oyster Bay home and determined the common cause of such typhoid fever outbreaks was contaminated water and milk. Mary Mallon became Soper's chief suspect after he learned that the family changed cooks shortly before the outbreak began at their home. Soper traced Mary Mallon's whereabouts and employment going back years, starting from the Oyster Bay outbreak. Typhoid fever outbreaks occurred at each of the previous locations she was employed at. Soper determined that each of these cases had the same thing in common. The residents of these homes became ill just days and even sometimes just weeks after Mary Mallon's arrival. So Mary Mallon was apprehended in March of 1907 in dramatic fashion when George Soper decided to confront Miss Mallon and immediately accuse her of spreading death and disease through her cooking. With Mallon now in health department custody after George Soper ended up going through the New York City health inspector to have her arrested. She was isolated to a cottage on the property of the Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island in New York. After some time in and out of forced isolation due to her attempted legal challenges against her captivity, a new health commissioner released her, but she had to promise to never cook again. Due to Mary Mallon's culinary skills being the only option she had to make a living, she broke her promise to put food on her table and was caught cooking again and was sent back into isolation for the rest of her life. So the book's pros and cons, I believe the pros were that I thought the author provided a very thorough analysis of the case and investigation. The author made a compelling argument about how society and those in authority should take more of a balanced approach when attempting to protect the community from disease, at the same time preserving individual rights. The author argued that it should not be a one-size-fits-all type of solution. Cons of the book is I was hoping that the author would provide a little bit more personal background information about Mary Mallon. The book portrayed her dilemma and her unjust captivity in a way that helps the reader understand her sadness and frustration, but I felt like I really walked away from the book not really knowing who Mary Mallon was as a person. And that is the end of my presentation. I appreciate you all, and thank you for listening today. Have a great week.